Welcome to the Universities South Africa Teaching and Learning Strategy Groups event, which is scheduled in our National Heritage Month. I'm Sizwe Mabizela. I'm the chair of USAF's Teaching and Learning Strategy Group, and my full-time job is that of Vice Chancellor of Rhodes University. I recognize that we have more than 237 people who have registered to attend this webinar. And we acknowledge the attendance of officials from the Department of Higher Education and Training. We acknowledge the presence of senior university members, academics, members of the public, and students. I wish to advise that all participants, the participants that the proceedings of this webinar are being recorded. We also request that you turn off your video in order to save the bandwidth, but we also request you to switch off your mic in order to reduce external interference. This seminar will present a set of perspectives arising out of a funded project with some ideas linked to historical developments aligned to curriculum transformation. We see this as a conversation that is collaborative, a conversation that is inclusive, and one that is participatory. And this webinar is a timely and relevant event at a very disruptive time in our lives as we weather a pandemic which has profoundly affected teaching and learning, not only at universities, but more broadly in our schooling system. It has compelled us to reimagine and rethink, but also to renegotiate the project of learning. But more important, this seminar is timely for historic reasons. 5 years ago, the student movement shaped the foundations of our higher education system. And the synopsis of this webinar expresses this quite clearly in the following way. A growing dissatisfaction with current syllabi and teaching models or methodologies has underpinned the social movement for transformation in higher education, especially since the 2015 student protests. If access to university studies and the diversification of student profiles were significant features of the first 2 decades of our democracy, then recent developments have spurred a return to the meaning of the curriculum and what is also described as the decolonial turn. Today's webinar focuses on insights related to strengthening the humanities and the sciences' capacity to engage these challenges and to contribute to equitable development. Now, these require research that can inspire practical techniques to reform the South African curriculum. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted customary teaching and learning processes and effectively exacerbated the inequity that is at the core of the teaching, learning, and knowledge project. You see, this pandemic has forced us to adopt what one might call a new normal. And it suggests that curriculum transformation should factor in changes that go beyond structural and material issues. So today's event brings together perspectives by people who are working in higher education and people who have been actively engaged with some of these ideas. We hope that the webinar will further stimulate discussion, share experiences, and develop new learning that will enhance teaching and learning. The core aspects of this webinar focus on insights drawn from a pilot project in a grant led by Professor Vasu Reddy titled Unsettling Paradigms, the Decolonial Term in the Humanities Curriculum, which is a national project with 8 research-intensive universities. You can access information on the website http://unsettlingparadigms.co.za. And Vasu will speak more about this grant shortly. The above project is funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation through a grant that was overseen by Professor Salim Badad, who I believe joins us today on this webinar. Professor Badad was the former program director, International Higher Education and Strategic Projects at the Mellon Foundation. Universities South Africa is deeply indebted to his leadership and his direction in supporting this grant and many other important grants that our universities received from the Mellon Foundation. I'm not going to read the biographies of each speaker. The detailed information in this regard is provided in the circular that you received. I will invite firstly USAF CEO, Professor Ahmed Bawa, to make a few opening comments. Professor Bawa.
Thank you, Sizwe. I'm sorry, I've just been sort of in and out of the meeting, unfortunately. This load shedding has affected us as well. So I just want to make 3 very brief comments just to begin things. It seems to me
Sorry, we are losing you, Ahmed.
That while this discussion focuses, this is to this, and I think that what we'll hear today is precisely this an opportunity to look at the different aspects of the decolonizing project, if you like. I think the important thing for us to remember is that while we are seeing this period as kind of as the COVID period, it is as an opportunity for reimagination and so on. We have to constantly remind ourselves that actually, that we had a major turning point with the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall student campaigns. I hear a lot about reimagining higher education during this time, during this COVID time. I think we have to constantly remind ourselves that we need to, that there is this period of 2015 to 2017, which has really reshaped our thinking about our universities. The second point is that it seems to me that the issue around decolonization of the South African Knowledge Project is really about how our universities enter the kind of global knowledge system, but on our terms. And on the terms that we lay out, if you like, and that it not be shaped by kind of the global knowledge system, whatever that is. And then, of course, there's the cliched question, which is that we have 26
You're breaking, Ahmed. So, look, I will arrange for you to come back and make your comments, if that is okay. All right? Okay, Professor Bauer is struggling with connection, but we will get him back once he is in a position where he can have better connectivity. Let me now request Professor Vasuredi from the University of Pretoria to explain to us what this project focuses on in relation to the decolonial turn. Vasu.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you very much. Yeah, if the presentation could be loaded. Thank you to all our colleagues who join and for the opportunity to share some perspectives on this Andrew Mellon funded grant. As you've indicated correctly, this is a timely grant. And again, my thanks and appreciation to Professor Badat, who has indicated that he will be joining us today. The project is titled, as you've indicated, Unsettling Paradigms, the Decolonial Turn in the Humanities Curriculum at Universities in South Africa. Certainly led by the University of Pretoria, but it's a project that, as you've correctly indicated, draws 8 collaborating institutions. And there you see it, the participation of several universities in the country. Let me just say something at this point about unsettling paradigms, which I think is central to the project as a whole. If we could leave it on slide 2, Heather, thanks. The title Unsettling Paradigms is quite important and deliberate because to unsettle is to some extent trouble and, you know, to alter, perhaps change. And what is to change, I think, is the big question here. It's about frameworks of thinking and certainly knowledge. Often, you know, to unsettle might seem to be a negative. We certainly see it in the knowledge domain as something that is positive. To a large extent, we are always engaging with changing and altering our positions in the way we make, recreate, and reimagine knowledge. I think central to the project is that it takes us beyond access to the broader question of curriculum, which I think is at the heart of the debate and the discussion. And to a large extent, much of the critical literature has said in South Africa that, you know, the curriculum has become a missing term in higher education policy. And what is also central here is that the curriculum is not simply an event, but a process. And debates around curriculum transformation are certainly not new, but they've certainly been re-energized, you know, as a result of the student movement to a large extent. But central to this is also the question of the meaning of the university in its broader context. If I could move to slide 3, to the 3rd slide. Yes, so the project in a broad nutshell is, as indicated, a 5-year project. It's certainly, you know, in terms of chronology, we're entering the 5th year, but by no means is this the end of the project. Central to the project, as I've indicated, is the question of the curriculum. The curriculum is certainly, as we've indicated in our thinking around this project, is that it's a neglected domain, certainly by no means erased from the broader questions of what does knowledge mean in this broader context. And the definition of curriculum, I think, is also deeply contested. I mean, to a large extent, we think of curriculum as a purposeful, intended set of experiences about decisions related to educational goals and how to achieve them. And certainly following the prominent scholar Bernstein, it's about what counts as valid knowledge. And I think this has become really critical and contested in the broad context post the student movement. And that learning has to be sensitive to a range of factors, certainly to sites of knowledge, as in terms of its production, but also in terms of its recontextualization. How is knowledge arranged and transformed into curricula? And certainly, thirdly, a critical conceptual issues around reproduction. To a large extent, how is production and recontextualization taking us into a transformed curricula? Certainly, there are a number of assumptions related to this project around broad transformation. Certainly, beyond advocacy and change, the question of context, the question of the diversity of knowledge, and certainly the meaning and rethinking of the curriculum. Assumptions often relate to the fact that the curriculum, as I've indicated, has been neglected, that we have untested assumptions about what are central, and to a large extent also attention to what is lacking, what are the gaps in the broader context of curriculum and its meaning in South Africa. And certainly the organizing frame of this project is the decolonial turn, which we recognize is an equally deeply contested concept. It's multi-layered, it's nuanced, it's conceptually slippery, but I think central to the issues that the decolonial turn, like many turns intellectually, direct us to epistemology, in other words, to how knowledge is organized, rethought, and reviewed, and certainly to the historical, also in the terms of how knowledge in relation to identities and social relations are reconstituted. So the decolonial turn is an organizing frame to this project to rethink a shift towards an inclusive and democratized curriculum, which brings us to the project aims, as you can see in this slide, which is central, as I pointed out, to revisiting assumptions, that which is also untested. The project is really, in its design and direction, is simply put, if I could say this, that how would a transformed, or what would a transformed humanities curriculum look like in our universities, recognizing differentiation in the system, in the higher education system, but more specifically, what would change and how would it change? And in order to get to that, these are some of the critical issues, and thinking around the inclusivity, around inter-epistemic dialogue, comparative analysis, and new learnings, challenging received assumptions and received perspectives, etc., which is quite central to the broad project. If we could move to the next slide, Heather. So conceptually, the project is framed on 3 R's, the letter R, if I could put it that way. The first one being recovery, and I'll turn to the next slide in a minute, but firstly, recovery. The second issue is reassessment, which I will come to, and the third issue is repositioning. With regard to recovery, what we're interested in this project is to map curriculum change over time. Certainly recovery as a word is focused on improvement, around return, call it that, retrieval, and reclaiming. What is to be reclaimed, I think, are big questions. Certainly in the project, as part of its scope around recovery, the question around erased voices, recognizing absences and gaps, and certainly to foreground polyphonic understandings of issues. Multivocality remains central in the broad project. Let's turn to the second concept in the next page, and that is reassessment. And here, central to reassessment is the interrogation of canonical figures and themes within current syllabi to produce a decolonial epistemic perspective. Broadly considered, I mean, what do Northern concepts, thinkers, for example, and Southern concepts and thinkers have to teach us about the meaning? For example, what would the work of structural anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, a European anthropologist, have to teach us or provide us with insights in terms of approaching, for example, a structural analysis of the European Union today or the African Union, for example. So reassessment is really about analysis, scrutiny, reconsideration, in fact, retrospection, which remains critical in the broader context of syllabi, topics, ingrained attitudes, and the legacy of thinkers. If I could move to the third conceptual frame, Heather, and that is repositioning. So you can see a clear metaphor of movement and change developing here. What's central to repositioning is to utilize insights from recovery and repositioning to produce a broader, a more holistic understanding of the world and its problems, call it its wicked problems, and the humanities have a critical role to play here, recognizing how the tension between what is privileged and what is marginalized, certainly in terms of voices. What is central in this particular slide or this concept around repositioning in the project is to look at the entanglement, the deep interconnections between recovery, reassessment, reshaping, repositioning, and the relationships that they give rise to that remain central. Certainly also the question of praxis cannot be ignored. Praxis in terms of interaction, collaboration with students at a practical way in making adjustments. And if I could move to the next slide, Heather. This is my final slide, but I'll pause here for a few minutes just to say a few final points. The issue of recovery, reassessment, repositioning, and praxis is certainly underlined in this broad project in terms of the work that our pilot project colleagues will report on, is focused on a couple of clusters. Beyond the core disciplines in the humanities and the generation of data, whether it's theses, dissertations, scholarly articles, creative outputs, and a changed curriculum, it's underpinned by a focus on theory and research, which really is critical. You know, a couple of questions that could be posed there are, what are some of the commonalities and differences in terms of debates and problems, as well as questions being raised and addressed? Who are the academics, students, and public actors involved? What models are being put into practice? How does the decolonization of knowledge materialize in actual experiences? A second component underpinning this conceptual frame is theory and teaching. Certainly there it's about locating, networking, strengthening decolonial initiatives directed towards redefining teaching. It's about really facilitating, enhancing reflective processes and conversations. Why is it important to consider renewal of teaching practice? What makes for good education? What are the necessary conditions for students' effective learning and teaching? And certainly, thirdly, which I think is central here around all of these issues related to recovery, reassessment, repositioning, and praxis, is the question of the hidden curriculum, which is not an old concept. It's certainly an established concept in curriculum work and our teaching, particularly around the influences and functioning of, at the organizational structure, issues around culture, spaces, symbols, narratives, embedded practices that speak to questions around language, voice, building and architecture, insignia, portraiture. All these remain critical in thinking about the broader question of curriculum change. And perhaps finally, I would say that the project is really not prescriptive. It's fundamentally focused on the broader issues around decentering, certainly not erasing. It's about creating new knowledge, a new ecology of knowledge, if you like. It's about recognizing the historical, the epistemological, which remain critical in terms of domains of knowledge and the broader questions around epistemic justice. But I think in all of this, what remains central are the fantastic opportunities presented by a project like this for scope, in terms of real, meaningful opportunities for exciting and fascinating work And perhaps I could end by saying we have funded over 30 pilot projects. It's a pity that we cannot represent all here today. One of the starting points of this project has always been that the interventions we are making now are not fundamentally brand new or novel. The debate, discussion on curriculum transformation has its roots in deep history, as I'm sure my colleague Michael Chapman will speak to, in recognizing some of the fantastic work that has taken place in the 80s and 90s, and perhaps much, much earlier. So, Chair, that's my brief introduction.
Thank you very much, Vasu. Indeed, that is immensely helpful, and we will pick up on your last point there regarding the history. For many, it may seem that the issue of curriculum transformation is a new development. Actually, it has a much deeper history, and we thought this webinar should provide some perspective about this history and engagement with issues that seem so alive and fresh in the 21st century, when in fact, they were highly current in the 1980s and 1990s. We have invited Professor Michael Chapman, a world-renowned scholar in South African literature, to share some of his insights in this regard. Professor Chapman.
Can you hear me?
Indeed,
can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
we can.
All right, the title. Okay, the title I was given: Post-colonial, decolonial curriculum framings in the 1980s, 1990s in South Africa. To decolonize gained new focus in South Africa in fallist campaigns of 2015 and more recently abroad in Black Lives Matter activism. In reaction to fallism, the Council for Higher Education insists that universities and colleges decolonize research, teaching, and curriculum design quickly. Yet, to decolonize is more complex than currently constitutes the discourse of decolonization, either in South Africa or the globe. It is more complex because we do not inhabit a world of singularities, whether political, economic, racial, religious, or cultural. To turn to university study, we might consider in past and comparative context the influential Nairobi literature debate of the late 1960s, details of which are captured by the Kenyan writer and academic Ngongo wa Thiong'o in his key work, Decolonizing the Mind, 1981. The issue at stake at the University of Nairobi was to redesign an English literature syllabus, which at the time replicated the British great tradition to the exclusion of African writers. While arguing for the inclusion of African works, Ngugi did not demand the exclusion of writers outside Africa. Rather, he asked what perspective the African academic and student should bring to the work, whether an African work or a Western work. In short, what to teach and how to teach it. As Ngugi put his faction, that is, greater ideological confirmation in psychological individuality than in communal or collective representation. It follows, therefore, that the book, the novel, the article, the design, the philosophical tract that advocates anti-imperialist action will probably be dismissed by the bourgeois class as defective in idea and or aesthetic persuasion. In short, yet even as he seemed to champion an either-or response, Ngugi's own writing suggested an ambivalence in which African idealism vied with Marxist materialism. Indeed, he continually qualified either-or with both and. At the University of Cape Town in 2015, for example, he rejected calls by fallists to evict white members of the audience from his guest lecture. "We must consider all views," said the author of Decolonizing the Mind. In the late 1970s, when I entered university teaching, English syllabuses in South Africa imitated F.R. Leavis's British Great Tradition from Chaucer to T.S. Eliot. No African or even South African writer featured on the reading list. Unlike most of my colleagues, I registered such a position as a lacuna. Just as I was attracted to Shakespeare, I was attracted to powerful new voices which, in academic circles of the day, provoked a certain disdain. I refer to the new black poetry of the 1970s, or as I dubbed it, Soweto poetry. The challenge to return again to Ngugi was not only to choose the work and motivate its inclusion on the syllabus, but also to adopt an appropriate perspective and hence an appropriate method of interpretation. In illustration, I quote, "Slowly he moves to and fro, then faster and faster he swishes up and down. Mother, where did I come from? When will I wear long trousers? Why will I drum?" 1971. According to the great tradition, great art supersedes the particular experience to strike a universal chord. Even as he alludes to experience, however, Machali reverses the particular universal equation. His boy on a swing is not universally any small boy. He is a boy in the apartheid society of his time. The strength, the originality of the poem is embedded paradoxically in the startling juxtaposition of the final line. Why was my father jailed? Is the aesthetic decolonial? Yes and no. But Charlie's poetic inheritance creatively imposed the English romantics on the streets of Soweto. Despite drawing energy and inspiration from the Black consciousness movements of the time, his poetry is not a poetry of Black singularity, at least as I interpret his poetry. My interpretation, of course, is open to challenge. What is my motivating ideology? If the new Black poetry avoided quick dichotomies between the West and the rest, so did a thinker who is currently cited frequently and selectively in decolonial and fallist demand. That is Frantz Fanon. On the barricades, we hear much of Fanon's insistence on a violent overthrow of colonialism. His context was the Algerian War of Independence. In university study, we must also note Fanon's prescience of what might follow such an overthrow: the ascendancy to power of a predatory and corrupt nationalistic political elite. To say no more than in South Africa today, Fanon presents the decolonized curriculum with challenges of perspective and interpretation. Although decolonization was not a buzzword at the time, the decade of the 1980s witnessed a dramatic turn towards local works and concerns, as in the following two extracts from book lists. From an English 3 syllabus, 1978, Shakespeare's Macbeth, Blake's poem London, Dickens's Hard Times, and Eliot's The Waste Land. From an English syllabus, 1988, again Shakespeare's Macbeth, but now Seroti's City Johannesburg, Plaatje's Mohudi, and Césaire's Return to My Native Land. But to return to Ngugi, it is not only what we teach, but how we teach it. It's universalism, the traditional literature expectation, but in its localism. How, in turn, might we teach Shakespeare? Should we teach Shakespeare in a decolonized curriculum? Well, as Salty Plaatje, the translator of Shakespeare into Setswana, realized, Shakespeare's plays had the potential to update their relevance to changing times. Even as Macbeth is haunted by the hellfires of a medieval world, he delivers a monologue that today still speaks to a nervous condition, his life reduced to a walking shadow full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Or, as Plaiki put it, the difference between Macbeth and too many men of the people is the matter of conscience, of Macbeth's capacity to feel his own shame. A valuable prompt by Plaiki to discussions on the relationship of literature and politics. But I suppose decoloniality would brand Plaiki disparagingly as a coconut. What I'm suggesting is that there is no panacea in matters of decolonized teaching, research, and curriculum design, and neither should there be. We might nonetheless keep the following in mind. 1, a necessary skills base, how to analyze, how to interpret, how to develop a language of the discipline, tools that in university study are rarely taught in a systematic way. 2, a clear articulation of purpose, perspective, and scope within an awareness of one's own ideological predisposition or prejudice, a framework to be shared explicitly with one's students. 3, a choice of study material together with explication as to what motivated the choice, explication that is usually absent from curriculum description. And 4, interpretation that eschews any temptation to essentialize categories, but in critical debate explores interchanges of the categories, the West and Africa. To pursue this last point, decoloniality observes that in post-Africa, but by the West, and that accordingly the task is to reverse the binary so as to center Africa. As I did in the 1970s, I retained sympathy for such a reversal. In 2020, however, the challenge for the academy, if not for the hustings, is to move beyond the second stage of a dialectic, not the West or Africa or the West, but the West, but Africa in the West and the West in Africa. Rather than either or, both and should be the key consideration in the construction of a decolonized curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That is really quite thought-provoking. We are not able to get back Professor Bauer at the moment, but we will invite him whenever he can. Colleagues, the perspectives by Vasu Reddy and Michael Chapman provide some context and historical background that create a logical lead into the presentations by our next 4 speakers. Each speaker will make a presentation providing a perspective of a project which is focused on one or more aspects of curriculum transformation. I recommend that we proceed with these presentations in the order in which they appear on the program. In other words, we'll start with Professor Lebo Molitsane from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, followed by Professor Ruxana Osman from Wits University, then Dr. Bodina Okeneke from Rhodes, and finally, Dr. Uhuru Palafala from Stellenbosch. Each presenter has a maximum of 10 minutes for their presentation. Of course, if they take less than 10 minutes, that will even be better. So let's start with Professor Molitsane. Over to you, Lebo.
Thank you, Prof. Mabizela. Good morning, everybody. The project I'm going to present on is titled, as shown on the screen, Recentering Rurality and Uncovering the Hidden Curriculum. I won't go into detail about the low completion rates among our students. That's a well-established research finding by now. What interests me is the lack of a coherent explanation, or at least a set of explanation that look into the complex set of factors that interact to influence student success in universities. A number of studies look into student background, referring to the so-called disadvantaged students, and conclude that indeed the factors things tend to be racialized, classed, and even gendered. A number of studies are emerging in a number of universities that look into the significance of place, and in particular the significance of rurality in how students fare at universities. A second set of studies look, and these are few, look into the unpreparedness of higher education institutions, where, for example, institutional cultures in the main remain largely unchanged. Thirdly, the interventions so far have focused on transformation of the formal curriculum, the taught curriculum, and thereby ignoring the institutional cultures and informal practices that nevertheless influence students' success in universities. So we focus in our project on the hidden curriculum, as Professor Reddy outlined, and these are the implicit messages that students encounter through their interactions with various spaces in the university, but also their interactions with others in the university. And these combined tend to have a negative effect, often a negative effect on their success. So our project, pilot project, aims to try and disrupt these inequalities that are generated by these hidden messages. And we premised the project on the understanding that interventions that aim to do this must actively seek to understand and address the hidden curriculum. So we sought to engage first-year students of rural origin to develop an understanding of how they experience the educational spaces in our universities. The second aim has been to use this understanding to facilitate institutional dialogue about the hidden curriculum, so as to better support these students in their learning. And thirdly, we wanted to engage curriculum developers and policymakers in universities to engage with students on how we develop alternative structures. So the project so far, and it has been disrupted by COVID, and of course at UKZN, the student protest early in the year. So far we have engaged with first-year medical education students of rural origin. We basing our investigation and our project on a conceptual framework that we developed in a previous project that we worked on in the College of Health Sciences, with the College of Health Sciences. Two postgraduate students did a scoping review in which they investigated how the hidden curriculum is understood. And from their scoping review, they came up with those 4 concepts in how the hidden curriculum is understood and might be investigated. So the institutional, organizational, I won't spend time defining what that means, interpersonal and social, the contextual and the cultural, the motivational and psychological, as some of the factors or some of the concepts that play a role in how students are socialized and how students indeed learn. The project is also premised on what has been highlighted so far. Whose knowledge is it anyway? Learning from sociologists and Oakley's age-old question, what would it really mean to study the world, in this case of university access and success, from the standpoint of students, both as knowers and as change agents? And how might our research look differently? Such research is emerging, of course, in South Africa, and a good example is a study that was led by the HSRC, published in a book called Studying While Black. It is available, of course, for free on download. And the book is accompanied by a video documentary, Ready or Not, Black Students' Experiences of South African Universities. It's available on YouTube. So the methodology that we are using, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time here, is premised on the understanding that the hidden curriculum is both hidden, but also visible in the structures in and around campus. And that understanding the way institutional culture works is a tool for understanding how visual culture in these institutions also work. So we adopted a participatory visual methodology, which is located in visual sociology, as our methodology for the project. And our methodology is premised on the understanding that people who experience the problem are in the best position to tell us about the issue that they are experiencing. And therefore, our project is participatory in nature. It is collaborative, consultative, and collegial. But we also recognize that it requires long and term engagement with the students and the end users of what we're going to produce. So the project since 2019 has been engaging in a workshop series, drawing on so far 3 methods of data generation, arts-based data generation methods, drawing, photo, voice, and letter writing. We were planning early this year to do a final one on participatory community mapping, or participatory institutional mapping, if you like. The first one, the first workshop series drew on metaphor drawing, and a method that has been used for enabling participants to take a reflexive look at their ideas, their feelings, and the social issues they are experiencing, and which is a draw and talk. So participants draw their ideas and then talk to them, to the larger group. So our prompt to them was draw 2 pictures, one that represents your positive experiences of being at university, and one that represents negative experiences. And these were some of the examples from the students struggling to fit in, and feeling welcomed and feeling supported by provision of transport. The second one has been used a lot, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. Photo voice, which can be traced back to the work of Paulo Freire, but which was then developed by Caroline Wang and her colleagues. And to engage our participants in this, we asked them to each take 2 photographs, one that represents a sense of belonging in the university, and one that represents a sense of not belonging in the university. And these are some of the pictures, unequal power contained in signs and symbols on campus. The huge academic load that first-year students suddenly come across when they enter university, and the role of the built environment. There were positive and negative experiences of the built environment. And the last one was letter writing, which has been used a lot by feminist scholars throughout the world. And our prompt to the students was, look at the picture on your student card. What would you say to your past self that might have helped you to get through first year of university? Write a letter to your younger self. And I know these are not very clear, but these are some of the letters that we got. Reflecting on what it was like to enter university and not knowing some of things. And of course, I won't spend a lot of time on that. We then used these visual artifacts as a way to get into critical discussions with the students. And some of the discussions centered around their feelings of struggling to fit into the university. I was struck by this student's reflection that, there are many people here, and stressing it over and over. It's just that there are a lot of people here. And reflecting on how there should be spaces that would enable people like him to reflect on these experiences and to try and find solutions to them. In terms of developing or feeling like they belonged, the students drew on their strengths in terms of being open-minded, just allowing themselves to learn from others, and of course, not surprisingly, relied on peer support more than support from us as academics. So those were some of the examples. We also wanted to use these visual artifacts to curate exhibitions that would facilitate campus dialogues. And but this stage of our project has been disrupted, of course, by student protests and then by COVID. Following that, or together with that, we wanted to then facilitate a process where students would advocate and lobby policymakers and curriculum developers at the university about the issues that they encounter and identifying alternative ways of being. So we think that this project makes methodological contributions to humanities research. The first being that research and community engagement are and should not be mutually exclusive, that you can do one and as well as the other. And that the methods that we use, particularly the arts-based methods, have been useful in sort of unearthing the silenced voices of rural origin students in this case. And it has allowed us to conduct a multidisciplinary analysis informed by a humanities lens into the curriculum. And as I said, we wanted to use the visual artifacts to begin a series of critical dialogues across the campuses. But what we are left wondering and are still trying to figure out is how do we ensure that these students-led dialogues are sustained beyond the funded period around the issues raised in this project. Thank you. I forgot to look at the time, so I hope I didn't exceed.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. Our next panelist is Professor Osman from Wits University. She will address us on socially just epistemologies. Roxana.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks also very much for inviting me to this webinar. I do want to take this opportunity to thank USAF and the full USAF team, Janet and Tualo, for facilitating this, and of course the Teaching and Learning Strategy Group. I want to extend a special thanks to Professor Vasu Reddy for creating this platform so that we could share findings and insights from this multi-university project. And then a special thanks to my fellow panelists. Chair, I'm fully aware I have 10 minutes to make a contribution, and I will stick to time. Professor Reddy, thanks for providing us with markers for presentations, and I will go along these lines. Let me begin by giving a very brief description of what the pilot project was about. And actually, I really appreciate Michael's presentation at the beginning, which gave a very clear context. And as all of us know, none of this work can be done. We can't do this kind of work without knowing where we've come from. And I think Vasu gave a very good overview of the overall projects around recovering, reassessing, repositioning, and reshaping in terms of knowledges. I'll give a very brief context to how we came to this project. I'll offer about 4 insights and then end with 2 provocations. And let me begin by just giving a brief context. I mean, all of us are aware that education and higher education reproduces many of the inequalities and injustices that we see. But at the same time, education remains a site, an inspiring and an aspirational site for hope. And it was in this context that I mounted this project. The global context of the academy and even the local context of the academy has come under considerable criticism from time to time, with calls from government, big business, and even students demanding to understand the relationship of universities to society. There are always demands to understand the cost of universities and the benefits of such education. And then, of course, in the context of this project, the demands to understand the relevance of university curricula for the daily lives and realities of students. And it is on this question of relevance that this project has been mounted. On the issue of relevance, universities have been criticized for being out of touch with students' lives, of teaching courses and curricula that are outdated, or course content that is Eurocentric, unresponsive, and alienating for the majority of students. The call for transformation in South Africa and beyond is reflective of a deep dissatisfaction with the role that universities are playing in encouraging social change. Indeed, movements like Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall campaigns argued that South African universities are not taking into account contextual understandings and are rather reflecting ideas espoused from elsewhere and reinforcing ways of thinking and understanding that are disempowering, not just for teachers, but even for students who are on the receiving end of such education. The South African higher education reflects an environment that is more concerned with the canon of disciplines largely developed outside of Africa than how we prepare our students to be thoughtful, reflective, and critical thinkers based on an African experience. Now, this dissatisfaction with higher education is not new. Of course, the intensity changes as the global context change. So currently, it is around curriculum responsiveness and curriculum relevance. Now, these concerns about education have been raised repeatedly by many scholars. Many have used Fanon as a reference point, Giroux as a reference point, or even Ndlovu Gacheni as a reference point. In fact, Professor Gacheni, in his recent book on epistemic freedom in Africa, reminds us too about the disconnection of education from the everyday lives of students and even irrelevant to everyday lived experience, resulting in passivity among students rather than active engagement in societal problems. So it was this context of higher education that the project was mounted, and the project considers the idea of socially just epistemologies in higher education. In particular, it undertakes to explore themes that consider transformation of universities through a set of pedagogical interventions and stances that integrates a sense of moral and ethical purpose to learning, a project that actively integrates pluralism in developing knowledges and understandings that aspire to liberate the learner from existing power structures, and a project which fosters a desire to challenge and change the social system in which we live. And finally, a project which tried to find ways in which we connect the reality around us and in many problems to the its many problems to the knowledge generation process. So there were 4 big aims, and quite lofty aims, I might argue. And I'm not sure that, I mean, the insights are interesting in relation to these aims, but those were the 4 aims. My approach was really, I invited a number of academics from a number of universities at home and internationally to explore pedagogical interventions across a variety of disciplinary areas in the humanities and the social sciences. The idea was that in their courses, they would advance social justice in the way that I've described above, which is pluralism, ethical purpose of learning, and so on. What were then 4, I'm going to offer 4 key insights that emerged from this project. And actually, I'm beginning to see in Lebo's presentation and the presentations that are going to come, some of these insights, I'm seeing them in those projects as well. So one of the key insights for social justice work is that it does not adhere to theoretical, methodological, or disciplinary fidelity. It draws on artistic, quantitative work, literacy work, and even technological work and affective work. In other words, the work that my colleagues did in this project cut across different theoretical domains, methodological domains, and even disciplinary domains. And in a way, this insight suggests that social justice work in the university presents an opportunity for transdisciplinarity that many people speak about. Most people speak about the transdisciplinarity in the context of the sciences and the humanities, but this, one of the insights from our project showed those possibilities even within the humanities and the social sciences. A second key insight was that such work advanced the politics of solidarity. So it opened up spaces for academics across universities and disciplinary areas to work together, doing reciprocal and collaborative work to advance socially just pedagogies, and at the same time advance the knowledge project of higher education. The third insight was that this collaborative work shows what socially just praxis looks like. And it offers a promise, I think, in this COVID moment, it shows how we can hold on to the social so that it finds expression, not in the idea of distancing, but in innovative and thoughtful ways of being together in the academy. The last insight, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on this insight, and this is that what we noticed across the projects is that you can very well do justice pedagogies and social justice epistemologies, but this work intersects with other social justice struggles in the university and even outside the university. So you have to engage, and Vasu made reference to it in his presentation about the project, and so did Michael, and that is that you have to engage the material, structure, pedagogical, and epistemic constituents of social justice. In other words, that there are interconnections between the material, the structural, the epistemic, and the pedagogical. And in some ways, I would say that the pedagogical, which my project focused on, is not sufficient because of this interconnection. And we get to see this clearly in this project, that it's not sufficient. Allow me to elaborate on the structural a little bit more. The point I want to make about the structural is that we have to find and focus on the structural drivers for social justice as well through education. Now, while pedagogy is the lifeblood of a thriving university and the basis for engagement between teacher and student, a key question does emerge from this project is how then do we scale this up for effecting change more broadly and through society? And here is a provocation. Is this a moment that recognizes that some of the societal solutions are indeed possible inside of the university? And if so, what must change? Pedagogy is not sufficient. We need system redesign, but even that has its limits. And Vasu, an insight for me that I've seen more recently is how we've focused on recovering, on reassessing, on repositioning and reshaping. I think there's room now for repair as well, because the system in which we're working with this project has shown that the pedagogical is just not enough. So I think the key insight for all of us in this project is it's fine to work on the small scale projects, but do they have sufficient momentum to change the university in the way that universities are being criticized in being unresponsive, in presenting unresponsive curricula, or that the cost benefit is not clearly articulated. Having said, having just focused on the insights from the project, I want to put two points or two provocations. And the one is, Michael pointed out that the decades just when apartheid was being dismantled, there was a lot of focus on access to education. And I wonder, will socially just teaching be on the back foot with emergency remote teaching? In other words, emergency remote teaching is raising questions about access. And are we back to questions of access, this time digital access? And will it take us away from curriculum and only back to the question of access? Or will socially just pedagogies and research into such work still be able to thrive while we're focusing on questions of digital access? So I think the moment for us that we find ourselves as universities having pivoted to emergency remote teaching, is that going to the gains that we have achieved with socially just teaching back to questions of access? And that is just by way of provocation that I would like to end my 10-minute presentation. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Osman, for that very challenging provocation. Let's proceed to our next presenter, Dr. McConaughey from Rhodes University. and she will address us on talking about Indigenous music.
Good morning, everybody, and
Good
thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm just going to share my screen with you quickly. There we go. So my project is called Talking About Indigenous Music, and addressing transformation, integration, and the decolonization of the curriculum on several levels. In 2017, the Rhodes University Department of Music and Musicology, partnered by the International Library of African Music, which I'll refer to as ILAM, introduced an African Instrumental Music Studies course developed to revalue and promote African ways of making and interacting with music. This course was designed to generate future teachers, culture bearers, and music lovers who would possess a deeper understanding of and feeling for Indigenous and traditional African musics, and who, as a result, would be able to engage with African musics through teaching, learning, and appreciation. This type of world music intervention, referred to ethnomusicologically as transmission and acquisition, is actually being practiced at universities globally, where ethnomusicologists and community musicians teach students about musics from all around the world. But we see our course in a slightly different light. In our situation, this African musical material is being taught to predominantly Southern African students who, for many different reasons, have been denied the opportunity to fully engage with musics from their own cultures. Our students aren't learning about an exotic music from another country or continent, but actually from their own African continent and their own cultures. So this is how important the transformation of the curriculum actually is. So the course is now part of the Rhodes University Instrumental Music Studies framework, which historically catered for Western instruments. Although it wasn't ideal to force this new course into an existing mold, administratively this proved to be the easiest way to introduce the subject. The main difference between the frameworks for Western instruments and African ensembles are that, of course, the African ensembles is mapped for a group and not for an individual performer. And very importantly, that it's open to students with no formal music training, whereas Western art music and jazz students must undergo an entrance test in order to rate their proficiency on their chosen instrument. So inviting students who have been denied a music making opportunity or have previously not been able to access music facilities is key to the transformative vision of our music department. The goal of the African Ensemble course is that throughout the year, students are exposed to and participate in different forms of African musical arts. The offerings change annually according to the skills and knowledge of the community musicians teaching at ILAM, but generally include the Zim Marimba Ensemble, the Southern African Instrument Ensemble, include Haliba, reed pipes, poon, and uadi, South African song and dance, Ghanaian and Nigerian percussive ensemble and dance work, and classes on Ugandan instruments such as the Ndengidi and Amadinda. In addition, students get a weekly lesson introducing fundamentals of music, as well as information regarding the context and history of the musics performed. Senior instruments build an instrument, a bow, a fiddle, or something of their choice, which they learn to play, and then formed mixed ensembles to perform standard and new forms of Indigenous musics. Now, turning to the real experts in the Eastern Cape, we have hired community musicians based in and around Makanda to collaborate with and assist in teaching the course, using an embodied and oral style of teaching based on the African principle of call and response. The musicians dance and perform with the students at all times, learning with and from each other. Drawing from community musicians' years of experience, the course outlines are drawn up annually, changing according to which visitors, so that we might learn more about this. Frameworks, tests, and examinations as a reflection of how much a student knows or has developed throughout the duration of the course. So our approach has been to convert the isolated exam experience into a fully fledged performance held at the end of each term, where students invite friends and family members to engage in the music making. We assess each group via generic music aesthetic, movement, and perceived enjoyment. Now, this brings me to the notion, promoted through historical contact with music making from the global north, that only the talented few should partake in musical performance. This course has absolutely proven that false. As we start analyzing data collected over the last 4 years, we have found that students who arguably may have struggled with other ways of learning have blossomed through the contact with Indigenous ways of thinking and sharing. This embodied pedagogical approach or experiential process encourages experimenting with knowledge firsthand instead of hearing or reading about others' experiences. Indeed, if we look at numbers, we can see how much this approach has worked. In our first year, we registered 27 first-year students, the second 42, the third 76, and this year 94 students. And the knock-on effect has also been really exciting. We have our first postgraduate students this year who have been through the whole program. In fact, African Ensemble students now amount for 3/4 of all the music students registered at our music department, which has tripled in number since 2016. Now, the value of this connective aesthetic as a methodological intervention offers a tangible connecting force that sparks imagination and intuition and creates new opportunities for dialogue, exchange, and personal connection. We found that the process of learning is more important than the course itself. In addition, some reflections each year from the students themselves have proven incredibly insightful. The value that they take away ranges from identity and social empowerment to practical and knowledge-based significance. Some have said, my confidence has grown substantially. Performing has now become a breeze, not only in IMS, but in other sectors of my life too. Another, this is a much needed alternative course offered. It grows. I hope it grows because it is necessary for a grounded liberal arts education. One said, before I joined this course, I knew nothing about African music, and as an African female, this has just reconnected me with my culture and has given me an understanding of the creativity of my ancestors. I love that one. Then, this is a great one too, I did not realize how broad African music is. There's a picture in the middle of the screen, and I must add a comment from him. His name is Praise Matipule, or Praise Smo, as he's known in the gospel singing world. Praise was a BCom student who was part of our first intake and is now a final year African Ensemble and ethnomusicology student. He changed his degree. His song, Fushale, won the South African gospel charts as of last week. He said, this African Ensemble course has changed my life. So agency development, both personal and relational, seems to rely heavily on the social space and structures provided for learning. Thus, having ILAM to work at, an ethnomusicology hub, but more importantly, a promoter of Indigenous ways of thinking, teaching, and learning has been key to the success of this course so far. Now, the road has been messy, and of course, this year particularly, as you've all mentioned, but our goals have not all been reached, far from that. One of the main goals is that we still need to convince the established epistemic Western art and jazz music communities that African musical arts should play a vital part of every music degree, and in my mind, every liberal arts degree in South Africa, and that learning music through this pathway is every bit as rigorous as through another. So what are my findings? Financially, always bring that up, African Ensemble uses less facilitators than Western art music and jazz forms of music making. We work with large groups of students, but the results in the same, they result in the same form of knowledge production, identity empowerment, and social cohesion. Pedagogically, using embodied ways of learning opens up the course to students who may, through other forms of learning, have struggled to gain purposeful knowledge. Transparent the university community to break through previously established norms of musical devaluation. And socially, empowering community musicians to take their place in tertiary institutions based on their skill and not academic ability invests in the social revaluation of traditional and Indigenous knowledge systems. Thus, despite it at the our connective aesthetic approach to capacity and agency development allowed for new empathic social climates to emerge, and thus greater parity. We are trying to level the playing field and construct and our understanding.
Thank you very much. Budena, you are muted. Do you want to make a final point?
Thank you very much. That's all I had to say.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. McKenneke. Our next speaker is Dr. Uhuru Palafala from the University of Stellenbosch, and she'll address us on recovering subterranean archives. Uhuru.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to the organizers of this webinar, and thank you to my fellow panelists as well. So this morning, I'm going to be sharing with you my project, Recovering Subterranean Archives, which emerges as my own personal disgruntlement with the curricula that I learned in my undergrad studies. I studied literature in my undergrad, and we learned that the 1960s was a period of silence. It was the silent decade. Now, at the time, I didn't know much about what was happening in the 60s. That's why I was in said class. But I knew that the 60s is arguably one of the most important decade of the 20th century. There was mass decolonization. There was, the Cold War was kind of escalating and getting hot in these parts of the world that are in the Southern Hemisphere. So I knew that, we cannot be coming as well out of a very robust political and cultural era in the 1950s of the drum decade, of the defiance campaigns, and then all of a sudden 1960 happens, Sharpeville massacre happens, and then apparently everything goes silent. I knew that something is amiss. So I identified in this project that the banning, the censorship, the jailing, and the exile of cultural workers happened immediately after the Sharpeville massacre, when the apartheid machine was tightening and throwing a massive dragnet on all of these cultural and political movements and figures. And it became quite clear to me that if we are then looking for South African culture in the 1960s, it will not be enough to look for it in the country. It's not enough to look for it within the national borders. I identified the colonial border as equally a border of knowledge that produces and reproduces epistemic injustice, which is what I was feeling when I was being taught about this silent decade. My project argues that 1960s and 1970s South African culture is deterritorialized. And that is to say that it is to be found mostly everywhere in the world than in South Africa. Of course, I fully acknowledge the Black consciousness movement poetry that emerged in the 1970s and that we kind of know as the staple in the curricula, if you're lucky enough to even learn about it. So this is the huge gap in our archives and in curricula that I have identified as occurring due to the lack of return of this deterritorialized culture that is everywhere in the world than in South Africa. So recovering subterranean archives then as a project thinks about recovery as a process of moving from that lacuna, from the gap, from fragmentation, but also from illness, because you are not well when there's fragmentation, when there's dismemberment, if I can use Toni Morrison's phrase of dismembering and remembering. That recovery from fragmentation or illness to wholeness and wellness. Recovery, as I think of it, is an act of healing and repairing. And I think about the subterranean as the underground that, for instance, immediately after the Sharpeville massacre, political movements and cultural movements went into the underground. And I think of it, of course, it's not a literal or a physical one, but also a metaphorical underground. The Subterranean also looks at that which is not in the mainstream. So, of course, if we are only looking above the ground for South African literature, we will then come to the conclusion that it was a silent decade. Recovering the Subterranean has to do with excavation and exhuming into that underground to bring up to the surface, to return and to integrate. And one of the methodologies of interviews that will be used to fill the gap in the archives is an act of healing. My work here as a healer also becomes quite important, because you interview all these political and cultural figures who were in exile, and you're asking of them to look into very personal aspects of their lives, very painful and alienating aspects of their lives. So you're kind of, as well as an interviewer, you are holding space for them to do their own exhuming and excavation and name what comes up, and then share it and see that without this knowledge, there's an incompleteness, there's an unwellness. Therefore, the aims of the project are very simple: investigate South African culture in exile, repatriate it, republish or reissue it, and insert it into the curriculum. The objectives of the project, I will just outline them and give a little bit more detail. So recovering South African cultural texts from exile, what does that entail? It entails mapping the movements of South African cultural workers in exile and looking at what happened. How did they leave the country? Mostly through exit permits. So they were already kind of a fugitive cultural workers, which is to say, then they were somehow clandestine, hiding. So we have to kind of start mapping from that point onwards. Where do they go when they leave the country and so forth? Those who have returned, it's been vital, very important to interview them and have this archive for posterity and for the contemporary moment. Then, with what we find, we reassess the theory regarding South African cultural production, and a point in case would be the silent decade. We can no longer be satisfied with using that analysis when we teach South African literature. We can reassess theory because we are now going to have to rethink the notions of nation, language, national culture, citizenship, South African vernaculars. I'm thinking of Mazisi Kunene, who was writing in isiZulu while he was at UCLA, when he was in the US, drawing from Setswana mythology and cosmology in his work, and how these vernaculars have constituted to world making and have influenced other cultural workers in the world. And then repositioning South African culture within a robust and generative world-making network. When they left, these people, where did they settle in these networks of solidarity? They settled in everywhere in the world. I really cannot stress enough how much South Africans have impacted world culture. They've settled in Nigeria, in the Soviet Union. We know the ANC was funded by Russia, or at least its military wing, Scandinavia, Latin America, everywhere in the world. And, we will rethink the intersections of anti-apartheid, anti-colonial, Jim Crow politics, and so forth and so forth. That's what's also important, is to think about South African cultural workers and their pedagogical work in international universities. They have constructed very, very fascinating, potent, and interesting, useful, generative, transformational curricula that they've taught elsewhere except in this country. I've already given the example of Mazizi Kunene at UCLA, but we also know Eskiam Patlele's long period of teaching at Denver, Colorado University, and so forth and so forth. What were they teaching? I'm interested in that. And then when we have all of this, we can insert the recovered text in curricula. In 2019, in January, we held a conference here at the University of Stellenbosch, in which I invited a number of scholars who are working on South African culture in exile. I didn't only invite scholars, but I invited artists and other cultural workers. And the papers that were delivered were fascinating, as they were mapping all these South Africans that I have listed on the right panel of this slide. It was a completely successful, but also an eye-opening and transformative conference, where we learned, some of these artists, political figures, and so forth. Some I didn't know, and it was extremely successful. And I have then decided, moving forward, to send a proposal for a book project to put all of these books to all of these papers together, and the book would simply be called Recovering Subterranean Archives, because that is what everybody is doing, and putting a book together with these papers to continue the project of archiving for posterity, to encourage postgraduate scholars and academics and artists to draw on this work in their work. I want to quickly also look at our repatriation project. We repatriated an anthology of poetry by ANC women in exile. It was published in 1981. I worked with Utlanga Press to republish it. It really is a fantastic addition to our archive, as it presents multiple opportunities for research. We already have a master's student at Wits who is doing her master's on this book. It really is amazing, as it establishes the place of women artists in the history of South Africa's liberation. I'm not going to get too much into this text, but I thought it's important for you to see it and to just know that I have inserted it in my Black Consciousness Movement curricula for first years at Stellenbosch University. Previously, this corpus of work, the BCM poetry, was troubled by a lack of gender representation, and bringing this book from the underground into the curricula has presented an opportunity to repair, to recover, to fill a gap, to rethink, and so forth. These are just some of the other texts that were published in the 60s, the supposedly silent decade. I will stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Uhuru. And a big thank you to all the panel members for the rich and important insights that you have shared with us. In order to provoke a deeper discussion, I'd like to ask our two respondents, Professor Sabelo Ndlovu-Katyeni of the University of Bayreuth in Germany, and Siseko Khumalo, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Pretoria, to provide some responses to these presentations. And each respondent has 10 minutes to speak. Let's start with you, Professor Ndovukatjeni.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I hope everyone can hear me. It was really a privilege to listen to these very, very exciting projects under the Unsettling Paradigms and the Reimagining a Curriculum. And I must say from this outset that the questions which are concerning the group in South Africa, I found them to be also key questions here in Germany, whereby I'm at the moment holding a chair in epistemologies of the Global South and trying to address some of the questions which were raised here. And they were also here trying were involved in a project on reconfiguring African studies, which also speaks to some of the issues raised here. I won't try to even summarize the important projects which were presented. What I'm going to do is just to raise a few issues which I hope will provoke discussion. I think one of the main issues which actually is emerging across is this issue of reimagining a curriculum. What type of a curriculum are we trying to reimagine? I think one of the issues which emerges across, there is an emergence of what I will, for lack of a better term, we are imagining a curriculum where there is no over-representation of thought, writings, and even theories from one province of the world, actually preoccupying the other provinces of the world. And for this, I will speak about in terms of, we are thinking of a curriculum where there is really this issue of balance between deprovincialization, because Europe has actually moved into the center of the world and made this knowledge really the knowledge of the world. And there is a pushback now in trying to say, but let's re-provincialize Europe. Let's try to deprovincialize other parts of the world, so that we address this issue of over-representation and under-representation of some knowledges from other parts of the world. That's one. The second issue, which I think is emerging also from a reimagining of a curriculum, is we're going back and forth on the issues of disciplines. Particularly, what do we do with the disciplinary base of knowledge? Bearing in mind that people like Michel Foucault, they already told us that the modern disciplines emerged at a particular moment in human history to address particular problems. And the question for us, I think a practical question for us as we reimagine a new curriculum, is the current disciplinary organization of knowledge, is it working for us? And what we need to then think practically is to go back to the question of the fitness for purpose of the current disciplinary organization of knowledge, and the issue of relevance, which I think was very prominent across all the presentations, and indeed the value for time and for money for those whom we enroll into these disciplines. And then the third issue, which I think also became important, is the issue of, already we are thinking within a context in which there is a dominant knowledge already within the curricula. And the question is, what do we do with that dominant knowledge? Do we remove and replace, or we need to think creatively about how to deal with it? I remember, is it Michael Chapman who was speaking about, is not either or. It's really, how do we deal with this question of dominant knowledge in such a way that we don't say we're removing what comes from Europe and putting what comes from Africa? I think we need to think carefully there in terms of what we need to do is to open up rather than to close. We're not actually in a project of ghettoizing the Africa. What we're actually trying to do with the decolonization is actually to open up and to democratize knowledge. In other words, the dominant knowledge is not for removal, is actually to then complicate it by bringing in other knowledges. And I think it was Vasu who spoke about perhaps the concept of ecologies of knowledges. And that, I think, becomes the starting point where we then think about what we call mosaic epistemology and the convivial epistemologies, whereby the knowledges from different geopolitical regions of the world come together within a context of an academy to enhance the human life. And that's what we mean by ecologies of knowledge. So it is not about removal and replacing. Then the other fourth issue, which I think is important to think about perhaps, is also that when we think about dominant knowledge, there is also dominant theoretical, social theoretical foundations, or the normative foundations of theory. And I will recommend the book by Amy Allen, which speaks about decolonizing the normative foundations of critical theory, whereby we need to think about, should we think about civilization, salvation, progress, emancipation, development, which is actually the central part of Enlightenment thought, or during this time, we need to rethink that normative foundation so that we re-theorize, because there is a constant cutting thread across all the presentations about even the need to re-theorize. But more importantly, I think as I end, is the question of when we speak about a reimagined curriculum, I think we need to go back also to a very old question: who will educate the educators? And I think that we're still speaking as though we are still the educators, as though we are not actually the problem ourselves, in the sense, in the way we are produced by this globalized, westernized university, which gave us particular form of consciousness. And I think it would be important for us to think deeply about that. I think it was Karl Marx who raised the question of who will educate the educators. And I think as we do this reimagining of the curriculum, we need that modesty of actually accepting that we might have undergone miseducation, which actually has created a pitfalls of consciousness in ourselves as educators, so that as we do this work, we are also undergoing re-education or unlearning some of the things which we learned in order to relearn others. And this, to me, takes me to a very practical aspect which we need to engage in when we do this issue of reimagining curriculum. One of the main issues from the experience which I had when I was still in South Africa was that we put a lot of pressure on the academics to redo the curriculum. And a lot of them, they said, but the tools, the knowledges which we're equipped with at the moment are not enabling us enough to actually rethink what we're supposed to do. And we thought about something which was like the re-education, which actually speaks about the politics of knowledge for the educators themselves, so that they rewrite the curriculum having understood the complexities of the politics of education. And I think I will stop here and allow my colleague Khumalo to intervene.
Thank you very much, Sabelo, for your input. May I invite Sisego Khumalo, who is a doctoral candidate in political theory at the University of Pretoria, to provide a response. Thank you.
Angibonge kakhulu. Ngibonge futhi naku co-respondent wami uGajeni for setting up a conceptual framework that I think is rather useful for the work that I'm trying to do here this morning. Ngiphinde ngithathe leli thuba lokubonga futhi sihlalo ngibonge isimemo enithena sikhipha as University of South Africa to have us participate in this kind of conversation. I want to touch on a couple of things, mainly three particular questions or three roles or three conceptions that I see coming out of the discussion as we're having it here this morning. This is, of course, the question of the historicity of decolonization in the South African context, which ties into the debates, the very, very serious debates that have been happening in the South African context in the literary domain, in terms of higher education and knowledge production as well, in terms of how some of these debates have contested and played themselves out. And I'll contrast that with what has happened in music and how we begin then to see music as a place where we can think quite deeply and philosophically about the propositions of the ontologies of Blackness in South Africa. And then I'll conclude, of course, by this question of access with respect to whose knowledge it is that we are attempting to access and who are we trying to give access to, and in what particular modalities are we doing that kind of work. Now, to begin with the historical component or the historical question, I'd like to highlight something which I think has been missed, or which something has been neglected in the conversation this morning, that the question of curriculum decolonization or curriculum transformation in South Africa goes back as far back as the 19th century, colleagues. And I say this because if we think about Ingxoxo enkulu ngemfundo kaGqoba, which comes out in 1888, uGqoba is already posing this particular question of how is it that the indigenous in South Africa is educated. And this is something that he discusses as far back as 1888. Now, uGqoba is, of course, in conversation with other Black intellectuals at the time, Yomake Mafuzas, for instance, and Uhlonipha Mokoena at Wits University. Professor Mokoena does this work quite exceptionally well in terms of detailing how it is that Kanyeni, which was, of course, founded by John Colenso, does some important work in terms of inspiring critical interventions from Blackness and indigeneity in KwaZulu-Natal. So there's been a massive amount, and these are people who are, by the way, having these conversations, curating these conversations, as I say, as far back as the 19th century. And I wonder, as a devil's advocate, posing kind of question, why it is that we always neglect this information to say that this debate in South Africa is a long-raging debate. It's a long-standing debate. I wonder whether it is that we would like to see this information being reinvented, as it were, by particular categories or by particular categories of ontologies in the South African Academy. And we've seen this knowledge appropriation happening before, colleagues, in terms of African knowledges, in terms of African philosophy, but I will not get into that particular debate. So to move on then, so we see, as I say, this particular conversation of curricula happening as early as 1888 with William Wellington Gqoba through his poetry. Now, uKhupsana in 1906 in the publication Zemkingoma Magwalandini attempts to censor uGqoba, and of course we've seen that particular debate playing itself out with that collection that was co-authored, or that was co-edited rather, by Ulanduka, by Jeff Opland and Professor Pamela Maseko, whereby they showcase how it is that there were those censorships because uGqoba was necessarily inspiring these critical interventions and critical objections to the ways in which education was playing itself out in the South African context, right? And what then happens, of course, is that, again, if we crisscross that conversation to what was happening in KwaZulu-Natal, Umake Mafuza and Uhlonipha Mokoena actually writes about this, where she talks about an assembly of readers, where there was a sense of public intellectualism, whereby there were debates that were being held around the ways in which colonial education and colonial modes of thinking were fragmenting Black ontology. And we see this, of course, being taken up today in terms of the responses that we are getting from our undergraduate students in respect to how it is that they are not seeing themselves represented, right? They are showcasing, in many instances, a very, very historical question in South Africa, which is to say Black ontology is being fragmented, it's being reshaped in ways that suit particular ways of being in the world. And in many instances, indigeneity is saying enough is enough. And that's the charge that we are getting from students. Now, in the 20th century, of course, we see a number of interventions as well, with, for instance, Udlomo's work, H.I. Udlomo's work, Herbert Udlomo's work. He, of course, takes the conversation further by contesting the question of African modernity, right? So suggesting in many instances a move away from Western modernity and an invention of African modernity because of the ways in which education is reorienting Black ontology in the South African context. This, of course, comes from that particular school of thinking, Yabo Albert, Lutuli, etc., and some of the authors that have been mentioned by the panelists this morning, who are also applying themselves to this particular question, for instance. And I think about that particular intervention that was made in 1999 by Kwaku Gyasi, wherein he asks the question of writing as translation, right? Where he asks the question of what is it, or how can we claim that we have an African literature, a category of African literature, which is not written in African languages, which is rather of a problematic nature? Which then brings me to the question of, I would suggest, the insight that we can gain from music and that we can glean from music. And this is something that I've been thinking about in terms of my own work, working in the Black Archive, where I think through the curious question of what it is that music says about the theoretical propositions that were being made by Black artists and Black ontologists and Black artists about Black ontology in South Africa. If you think, for instance, to use a simple example, the work of Ubusin Mhlongo, when she says, she makes a poignant observation about the migrant labor system that was instituted as a result of the discovery of gold in the Rand up here in Gauteng. There's, of course, another particular piece of music that in that very same album that comes out in 1998, where she makes a curious claim about the question of capitalist consumerism and how it is even affecting the intimacy of love and courtship in that song titled Ukangangengane Weshela Ngemali. Now, what I'm suggesting here is to undergird or substantiate that claim that is made by Kwaku Gyasi, where he talks about an African literature that is written in English. And I suggest that the theoretical propositions of indigeneity around indigenous ontology are found in the music that was produced by Blackness and indigeneity, using Blackness, the languages of Blackness. So isiZulu, isiXhosa, Sepedi, Setswana, Sesotho, etc. And I believe that is where we can begin to look in terms of finding this particular work of unsettling curricula, and in many instances begin to theorize from a place that is located in Black ontology in a country whereby higher education is supposed to serve the purposes of correcting historical injustices and oppression. And to use as a final example, to tag on to what my dean suggests to Professor Basuredi around the question of unsettling paradigms, I want to ask us to think critically as a thought experiment around how COVID-19 is now radically reshaping the ways in which we are approaching knowledge production, specifically from a decolonial perspective. And I'll give us an example. Say, for instance, I were teaching in my home department in political sciences at the University of Pretoria. I would, for instance, be interested in presenting a course on sexualities, gender, and feminism. And as we see from the recent publication done by Professor Reddy and colleagues, Queer in Africa, there's always been this rejection of queerness and queer subjectivity around African ontology because, as Mahmoud Mamdani suggests us, we are still ensnared in colonial categories of thought and the inventions of African subjectivity as they were articulated by European modernity, which was, of course, as Mudimba suggests, inventing African ontology, right, as it went along with its process. Now, in this particular way, we then see this abjection, as I would suggest of it, of Black queerness, I suppose, on the African continent, something which is theorized, as I say, in that book, Queer in Africa. Now, what happens in a context where, for instance, a child or student that I am teaching is now reading this particular course and is reading this course in a conservative homestead, say, for instance, that is governed by Christian fundamentalism that is also predicated on Black or African tradition, right? And they're having to read and engage with literature that is outside of those particular values. I think when we're thinking about unsettling paradigms, specifically at this historical juncture of COVID-19, where our students are no longer in the safe bubble of the university, what do we do with the clashing paradigmatic forces between the ingrained and held ideas of the elder generation, the parents, of whose child is now a student in a political theory course that is considering the question of gender in very, very, I suppose, unnormative ways, as it were? How do we make sense of that particular conception of unsettling paradigms? And what opportunity does that present to us in terms of imagining knowledge production beyond just the university space, but taking the claim of knowledge democratization far more seriously, as our students now are bringing this particular knowledge into their local settings, in their local communities? In many instances, COVID-19, I would suggest, presents the opportunity of forcing us to democratize knowledge. And what do we do with this opportunity? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khumalo. And our big thank you to both our respondents, Professor Ndlovu Kacheni and Mr. Siseko Khumalo. We now have about half an hour for question and answer session. We will take questions in clusters of 3 or 4. If you could please keep your questions or comment brief. We'd appreciate it if you could post your question in the chat box. And when you do so, would you kindly indicate the person to whom the question is directed among the panelists. And if you could also identify yourself. So let's get to that session. We already have some questions which I will pose, and I think this relates to Professor Reddy and Ahmed. And I should convey Professor Ahmed Bawa's apologies. His connectivity was very weak and unstable and unreliable, and so he sends his apologies. The first question is, why is CPUT not involved in the project? And this came from Joste. The second one says, I'm interested to know how all institutions were brought together, in what way they are working together. That came from Leilani Smith. And the third question is, religion is not included in the core disciplines. The question is why? And that came from Buhle Mpofu. If Professor Reddy could respond to those three questions. Proceed.
Thank you, Chair. I think those questions are interrelated, so I'll assume that there's some responses that would provide a perspective to each. The founding grant was brought together, focused largely on the research-intensive universities, and that was a response to the funder. Those institutions that were part at that stage of the Mellon Fold, and there were 8 universities. Certainly at the stage or the decision-making time when this grant was funded, UKZN was not part of the Mellon Fold and subsequently became, I think, in 2018 and joined. Why CPUT is not involved is not a deliberate exclusion. In fact, this particular grant is actually founded on the basis that, with all research-intensive universities participating, part of our frame and our brief to such institutions is that as far as possible, they would include institutions that are not part of the Mellon Fold. So perhaps that might well be a question. It shouldn't have geography as a limiting factor here. Colleagues in the Western Cape, if I could use that as an example, are more than welcome to engage colleagues at other universities. So that gives us sort of a systemic response to how the grant was formulated and based on the criteria and recommendations. The fact that institutions are working together and how, I think, is central to the grant, particularly either within the university or in partnership with other institutions. That was part of the frame, part of the criteria in the pilot projects as well. I think there are some examples illustrated in the pilot projects here which give a sense of how colleagues are working within the institution across faculties, but also across some institutions in their region as well. And I would not be best placed to respond to that in its greater detail, and I think colleagues who are leading pilot projects are able to specify. The question around why is religion not included in the core disciplines? Religion is not excluded. Certainly, religion is a factor. I think some of the questions the respondents pose is really valuable. Religion is to a large extent also a broad humanities question. It's not just simply about, doctrine of thought aligned to a particular religion. There are deep questions around religion that speak to broader humanities. So again, this is a factor and a variable in the broader humanities equation. But let me just say this, religion as a discipline at most of our universities, well, of course, the sectors is quite differentiated, are not located in humanities faculties. So as I said in the last slide there, in the introduction to this grant, some of the core disciplines feature, languages, the interpretive social sciences in particular, and certainly the arts remain central. But religion certainly is a cross-cutting factor, no doubt, in the broader questions around humanities. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Vasu. The next set of questions directed to Michael. Your concluding thoughts suggest decoloniality should mean looking for the West in the South and the South in the West, if I'm correct. The Western or Cartesian body, mind duality has influenced much of colonial education systems, and so makes your proposition problematic. This is because such duality has led to problematic dichotomies. Learning as separate from knowledge, and knowledge as external to the process of knowing and doing. What are your thoughts on this, Michael? And the second one from Samia Chase. Regarding your reference to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, how is the issue of language, which he puts at the heart of the process of decolonizing the mind, addressed in the Unsettling Paradigms project? Proceed, Michael.
Okay. The first question about the dichotomy, I mean the Cartesian split, you can't get away from that. But my formulation was to ask how one goes beyond the either or of that split and to find a kind of a both and. How do you take an example, for example, the person dealing with COVID in South Africa, Professor Karim, is not divorced from the people from Fauci sitting in the United States. We are part of the world. The world is part of Africa. We've got to find a way of integrating without the one dominating the other, to learn from each other. Interestingly, another speaker who gets quoted again selectively in decoloniality is Steve Biko, in fact, who said that Black consciousness was a necessary antithesis to the thesis of white domination. But how do you move to a synthesis of a true humanity?
We have lost you
beyond that. Sorry?
Okay. All right. Let's proceed. There is a question from Paul Modipane. How do we connect this debate to the schooling system? Do we focus on transforming and reimagining the higher education curriculum away from schooling and teacher education? Are we going to wait for learners to come from a colonized schooling system to join higher education and then come into contact with a decolonized curriculum? I'm wondering as to where do we begin? What about the young people who are going to follow other pathways and come to universities? May I invite any of the panelists to respond to this? Any takers?
Yes, I don't mind answering.
Chair, I just wanted to respond to one of the questions that was not answered, and I directed to Mike Chapman around what is the role of African languages in this project. And I just want to say, and that has not been reported on, one of the pilot projects focuses specifically on African languages led by Rachel Kashula at Rhodes University, on how African languages were taught in the past, and the project is focused on interrogating current practices and repositioning African languages, particularly in terms of teaching to respond to the South African and global realities. I mean, more than that I cannot provide, but just to indicate to the person who posed that question, then African languages is also critical to this project, and certainly languages as well.
Okay. Can we then have a response to the decolonization and the schooling system?
Yes, I don't mind responding to that. So the Rhodes University, this music project that I presented on, is actually based on research done about intervention of the education of African music at school, how the high school curriculum that is being presented now, the CAPS document, speaks to having this integration, but it isn't happening at all. So we do have to take responsibility at tertiary institutions for what our students who then become teachers are feeding to the scholars at school. So it is vital that we take responsibility with what we're teaching so that the spiral, the circle that feeds each other can actually become decolonized, and that the information that our scholars are getting is a new and positively focused curriculum.
Thank you very much for your response. There's a question which pertains to language, and it was asked by Simnigiwe, and it was written in isiXhosa. He's saying that none of the presenters is using any of the African languages except English. And he says there's also a discussion about access to epistemology. Whose epistemology are our students being able to access? Mr. Kumalo, can you respond to that?
Yes, I can. I think for me, the question of language is a deeply, deeply rooted and fundamental question, because language in and of itself has to be and ought to be seen as an institution, because it undergirds the knowledge that we produce. Let's take, for instance, this example, if we think about the work of, and as I say, Ubusimhlongo, if we think about the work of Oliver Mdukudzi, this particular music really begins to theorize. For instance, there's a paper that just recently came out with Imbizo, Kauleza, an instantiation of the Black Archive, whereby I think about how it is that Black South African female artists were theorizing their lives. Ule Dambulu in 1993 does Amakamandela, not yet Uhuru, suggesting that the vast majority of indigeneity and Blackness still lives in abject poverty, disenfranchised from the mainstream. This is exactly what we see in 2020 with the rise of COVID-19. In many instances, when you think of that music that is 27 years old, you would think Uguti Ule Dambuli is theorizing about something that is happening right at this very moment. And so I think we have consistently neglected what we term low theory, what we term low culture. And this is music, this is theory, these are works that are produced in indigenous languages. And that is because in many respects, there has been substantial amounts of work that has been done in the South African context to delegitimate Blackness and Black ontology. Think about the Witchcraft Suppression Act, for instance, which went as far as to criminalize and penally encode the criminalization of Black ontology in the South African context. The idea of indigenous cosmology, indigenous ontology being represented in the mainstream begins to come up today, and in many respects comes up as inventions. Because we are trying to reconstitute what Ugajeni calls, Subterranean Ugajeni calls, this idea of remembering fragments of history as a result of this systematic decimation. But I would suggest that in many instances, as I still can access knowledge that was written, for instance, in the 19th century, in isiZulu, in isiXhosa, in Siswati, that a lot of the work that we need to do needs to go back in many instances to resurrecting that Black archive, to digging into that knowledge. And I would suggest that in many respects, we need to really prize the contribution that can be made through indigenous knowledges.
Thank you very much, Sisego. Professor Moletsane, this is a question from Dr. Manapula Mapesela regarding your presentation. I wonder how your students felt being labeled as students of rural origin. Didn't they feel stigmatized? The second question is, are students positioned at the core of the curriculum construction project? Are they co-constructors of this project, or are they positioned as research participants? The third question is, your project illustrates the need for an agency we need to ascribe to tackling artificial separation between learning as separate from knowledge and knowledge as external to the process of knowing and doing. Your project, it seems to me, elevates and gives voice to often overlooked aspects in our education system. That this came from Professor Mkwashu. And the last question from Paul, can you share the methodologies that you use to write and analyze the letters? Lebo.
Yes, interesting questions. I would like to start with the one about labeling students as rural origin. That question is good, but it assumes that there's something wrong with being rural origin. I'm rural origin myself, and I don't see anything wrong with that. But having said that, I understand where the question is coming from, and indeed, some of the students might feel that they are being labeled as less than because of the discourses around rurality in our country. But these students self-selected into the project. We sent out flyers and invitations and invited people who identify themselves as rural origin. And indeed, those who we enrolled in the project were self-identified. I will have to ask them explicitly how they felt about this label, rural origin. We haven't asked them how they feel, but from our discussions, they really appreciated the space that the project provides for them, away from the gaze of the rural dwellers who would, as they put it, judge them. And I can say more, but in the interest of time, I'll just end there. The second question I would like to address is how students are positioned in the project. To start off with, we can't run away from the fact that as researchers, we hold or are perceived by students to hold more power than they do. And we can't wish that away just because we want to. But having said that, as I said when I was introducing the methodology, we attempt by all means to make it a collaborative, participatory, and indeed to privilege the voices of the students. And so we see them as co-researcher participants. So they are very instrumental in generating the knowledge that we need to understand their experiences of the university, but we can't really run away from the fact that they are also participants in the study. So they hold those dual roles. I'm looking forward to the day where we can truly say that the research space is truly democratized, and that researchers, there's no separation between researchers and research participants, but we're working towards that. The next question I would like to address is a quick one in terms of analyzing the letters, or writing or getting students to write the letters and analyzing them. We simply based our project in that case in terms of the students' autobiographies. How can we use the students' autobiographies to understand who they are, how that influences how they access university and how they learn or not within the university space. So using autobiography as a starting point. In terms of analysis, we simply use a thematic analysis, but also critical discourse analysis to analyze the letters and other material that emerge from the project. I think have I answered all the questions? I think.
Yes, you have.
Yes.
And the next set of questions go to Professor Ndlovu Gajeni. What type of curriculum are we trying to reimagine? Something that is not overrepresented by one or a few provinces of the world. Secondly, is the concept of disciplines outdated? Are they fit for South Africa's purpose? Third, how do we handle the current dominant knowledge? How do we evolve and debate this knowledge? Fourth, how do we rethink and reimagine the normative foundations of critical theory? Fifth, who will educate the educators in this new curriculum? Who will develop new tools for these courses? And referring to your new base in Germany and your point on whether the division of disciplines is fit for purpose, how is this linked to the Humboldtian model of creating well-informed and well-rounded human beings? Do you see any remnant of that philosophy in Germany's higher education system today? And that comes from Samia Chase. Professor Kajeni.
Okay, thank you. Normally, I don't answer questions because basically I don't have the answers. I will just respond. I think these are very important questions. The German system, I can't actually claim to be on top of it now. I just arrived. But what I can say is that the Humboldtian template of the university is actually a template for many other universities, not only in Germany, but even beyond Germany. And the question of whether that German philosophy is still resonant today, I think it is. But again, we need to nuance and say, even the very idea of the university has been changing across time and space with the rise of other models of the universities, whether successful or not, such as popular university, such as developmental university, and now we're talking about a decolonized university. But the philosophy, I think in the domain of philosophy itself, there is a lot of debate on whether there is one definition of philosophy, the Germanic philosophy, the Greek philosophy, and you remember the debates on ethnophilosophy and today African philosophy. But from my own disciplinary base, which is I'm a historian by training, I can easily see the Germanic philosophy in history, in the sense that when we talk about the idea of history and the philosophy of history, it remains resistantly Hegelian in many ways, even if the historiography really brings in African actors within a set stage, a set concept of the idea and the philosophy of history. Then the question of the epistemological access and the issue of dominant or powerful knowledge. I think one of the starting points, which I think can help us to subvert that type of thinking, is to think about what Valentino Mudimbe once said in passing, though, in the idea of Africa, where he said, all human beings are born into valid and legitimate knowledge systems. And if we depart from that, it means really when people come to the academy, there is nobody who comes really empty. But the question which arises is, there is an epistemology which is in the modern academy. And that epistemology is the one whereby we always struggle to make everyone access. But I think if we think decolonially and they say all human beings are born into valid and legitimate knowledge system, therefore we recognize that it's not really about accessing one epistemological tradition, it's really about how do we bring together different epistemological traditions. And the second aspect of it is how do we de-hierarchize knowledge, so as to speak not of knowledge but of knowledges. And I think even the computer tends to refuse that word knowledges. It wants to say knowledge, But decolonially speaking, we must speak about knowledge is not knowledge. Then in terms of whether disciplines are outdated or not, I think that one is a major question. That's why I raised it when I was actually responding. I think it's important that we revisit the disciplines, not in terms of the what we call interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and multidisciplinarity. Because if you think that way, you are assuming that as a singular standing disciplines, they don't carry coloniality, but if you multiply it, you are actually reinforcing coloniality if they carry coloniality. So the issue is really to think about disciplines and their value. And I think when I was talking about the issue of how Michel Foucault talked about disciplines as emerging at a particular moment in modern history to solve particular problems, we need, in South Africa, we need to go back to the disciplines, say, are they serving our purpose? The organizing of knowledge in terms of disciplines, is it serving our purpose, or it actually then blinds us to the extent that the discipline becomes a lens through which we see human problems. Even when you see a simple problem as an accident happening in front of you, you begin to say, as a psychologist, I think this way, as a historian, I think this way, as an anthropologist, I think this way. Once you do that, we have fallen exactly into what Louis Arakoten terms the decadence, disciplinary decadence. You have actually reified the discipline, and the discipline becomes your only lens of how to see the world. And one of the propositions is that perhaps we try to move from being preoccupied with the disciplinary debates to be preoccupied with the human problems. I don't know how the practicalities of it, but that's basically what will be my responses to these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ndlovu-Kacheni. The final question goes to Siseko. If decolonial curriculum dates back to the 19th century, why do you think this is a new debate?
The debate is new because of the delegitimation of Black ontology and Black knowledge systems in South Africa. Because this knowledge has been buried in many instances, if buried in the sense that there are people who are writing about it. I think, for instance, of Undongela Masilela, who's been working on Udlomo's work. I think of Jabulani Sithole, for instance, in KwaZulu-Natal, who've been working on the work of Mazisu Kunene. I think of Pamela Maseko, who've been working with J.J. Arjolobe's corpus of knowledge production, Yali Manisi's work, Gopa's work, Mkhayi's work. But these are scholars in many instances who are not in the mainstream, as it were. They have been peripherized, they have been marginalized, and this serves particular interests, Slalo. It serves very, very particular interests in the sense that, and I'm sorry to take an antagonistic tone at this point, but I think it is necessary to reveal the power dynamics of knowledge production in this country. For a very long time, particular bodies have been seen as the legitimate knowledge producers in the South African context. And this has meant that even when Blackness makes particular knowledge propositions, those knowledge propositions are not taken seriously enough because it is Blackness and indigeneity who are making those knowledge propositions. I think about the debate of Ubuntu, for instance, if we take that as an example. We have, for instance, Mbogo More in South Africa, we have U.M.B. Ramose, who are incredible thinkers of Ubuntu, who not only understand the philosophy from its epistemological propositions, but also have ontological insight. Now, someone will say to me as an objection, but that is an essentialization of knowledge making. And I say, if you think about German phenomenology, and you cannot read and you cannot write German, and you have not read, for instance, Husserlian phenomenology in German, can you then claim, as Sabelo Ndlovu-Kacheni, for instance, could he claim to be an expert on German phenomenology now that he finds himself in Germany? I don't think so. If anything, a lot of colleagues in the German context would ask him the question of how can you make that claim, not only not having read the work, but also not only in German, but also then claiming this particular status. If we think it's the same question about feminism, I cannot write in feminism if I do not know the traditions and the iterative inflections of feminism, first, second, third wave feminism, etc., etc. Now, to claim to write about women's experiences, to claim to be a feminist thinker or feminist scholar, having not read feminism, is a bit problematic and curious, right? And I think in many respects, this is what we see. We see particular fiefdoms of knowledge production having been created in the South African context, and the appropriations of Black knowledge traditions by white scholars in South Africa in ways that are very, very problematic. So to say that this knowledge has been, and I think about what Dr. Uhuru has presented here today, which is this work of uncovering. And this is what a lot of us young scholars are doing at the moment. We are uncovering this work. We are bringing it into the mainstream because it exists. It's been there, but it's been ignored. And there's a huge amounts of work. There's Umkai's work, for instance. There's an entire collection at your university, at Rhodes University, that's been worked on by Russell Kashula and Jeff Opland that has been curated. And there's a number of work that's been done at Rhodes University to produce knowledge, systematically produce knowledge in isiXhosa, not only in African languages. I see that our colleagues in the politics and international studies department as well, Dr. Spogazi Magadla, is beginning to do that work in political theory, in IR, in international relations, beginning to explore what insights we get using isiZulu, using Shona, using Ndebele, using Sesotho, to begin to inflect our insights on international relations theory. So this knowledge has always existed. It's just that it's been buried for very, very particular reasons. And this is to say, as I think Prof. Reddy suggested earlier as he was making his opening remarks, that we make particular curatorial decisions on the premise of our own agendas, our own political and our own paradigmatic agendas as knowledge producers. Knowledge is not this amorphous thing that is removed from politics and socio-historical contextuality. It is very much embedded in our ontologies, and we make propositional claims from that particular basis.
Thank you very much, Siseko. I think we have come to the end of our discussion. It was not intended to find answers to all the questions, but to stimulate discussion. So on behalf of Yusuf, I wish to offer our heartfelt appreciation to all the presenters and also to you all for your participation in this webinar. Our appreciation and deep gratitude extend to the organizing team for assembling this webinar. May I invite you all to unmute at this stage, turn your video on, and let's all give a warm round of applause to our presenters, the organizing team, and of course, yourselves for having been a great audience. Thank you very much. Stay safe. Everybody.
It was cool.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sejwan.
Yes, well done, guys. Thank you, much appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay, cheers, bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.